And God said, "Let there be
The
light."
Lord says, "Let my people go."
I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.
This is the Talkin Bible podcast.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another week, the pre-Easter week of 2025 of Talkin Bible with me, Rohan Bell, and Phil Wearden. Hello, Phil.
Hello, Rohan.
We are backing up. We've just finished recording Friday's episode, and here we are recording Monday's episode. So a bit of a gap as you listen to this, but we're just going to go straight on so that we're not here at 10 o'clock at night recording. You start work at what time in the morning?
7:30.
7:30 in Wollongong, travelling from Narellan. So what time do you leave home, 6:30?
Just after 6.
Just after 6.
Give me a little bit of time to,
So as we
I'm not
record this
rushing.
at 6:40, so you're starting to feel weary?
A little bit.
A little bit. We've got to...
We'll get there.
Let's see if we can smash through 5 episodes in... Let's do 5 episodes in an hour. How's that sound?
See how we go.
That's 10...
12 minutes
12 minutes
each.
an episode. My maths wasn't very good. 12 minutes an episode. We need Jeannie with her timer. Okay, guys, let's go. Parable of the yeast.
So it says in Matthew, Jesus also uses this illustration, the kingdom of heaven. So talking about the kingdom of heaven is like a yeast a woman used in making bread. Even though she put only a little yeast in 3 measures of flour, it permeated every part of the dough. Jesus also used stories and illustrations like these when speaking to the crowds. In fact, he never spoke to them without using such parables. This fulfilled what the prophet had spoken through the prophet. I will speak to you in parables. I will explain things hidden since the creation of the world. So, kingdom of heaven. Why is it like yeast?
Why is it like yeast? Okay, let's talk about what yeast does. Let's start there. Because we unless we were in COVID making our own bread, I did do a bit of that. Had a bit of yeast, although I was using sourdough, so didn't need to use yeast. But I've made pizza dough with yeast before. So yeast is something small which mixes into bread and changes and makes it permeates the whole batch of dough. So in fact, I can't remember now. I should have looked it up. There's something about this story where we skip over. It says a little bit of yeast in 3 measures of dough. Do you have anything about that? I think
No, I don't.
I've got a feeling 3 measures of dough is a lot of dough.
I thought it was, then I just had a thought, okay, 3 measures so that coming up to a special feast, there's part of it is given to, is made for Moses, one is made for
I think it might be linked to that in some way.
Passover, something is, so it's like, it's 3 separate.
3 separate measures
things,
or something.
but-
That sounds vaguely familiar to me.
Oh.
I got a feeling somewhere along the line it's like it must be feast related because it's like that amount of dough is supposed to feed like 100 people or something like that. Okay, so it's a lot of bread. We're not talking about this woman making just a couple of loaves to last to the week at home. This is a substantial amount. So if we just think about that, okay, that's a lot of bread, a lot of kingdom, or a lot of whatever it is we're talking about here, and it's a small amount of yeast that permeates in. So Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like. And in fact, many of the parables that we will discuss and look at this year, that's how Jesus talks about them. He uses parables to discuss what the kingdom of heaven is like. And when he says, let's start with this. When he says what the kingdom of heaven is like, we probably think that, that means what heaven is like. That's what it'll be like in heaven when I die and go to be with heaven. That's just eradicate that from your thinking, folks. That is not what Jesus is saying at all. When he says the kingdom of heaven is like, what he means is, what is it like when God's kingdom comes to the earth? When God's kingdom permeates the earth? Because the view of the message of the Bible is the reunification of heaven and earth. God created a garden, which was heaven on earth, and he wanted the rest of the earth to look like the garden, like Eden in the garden. And so God's plan has always been that the kingdom of heaven would come to earth. Jesus tells us to pray, your kingdom come on earth as in heaven. So when Jesus is saying, what's the kingdom of heaven like? It's like, what is it like when the kingdom of heaven comes to earth? Let me tell you what that's like. That's like a woman who had lots of dough and a little bit of yeast. But what happened is that yeast got into that dough, spread throughout the dough, and made the whole thing grow. So now, what does that say to you about the kingdom of heaven, Phil?
It's the presence of God coming, like this, the Spirit of God, the presence of God living in us. Because we're like the dough. Like we could be the dough that's sort of, the Christ living in us, and we can spread to other people, like through us, Christ is reaching other people.
Very good. So there's a personal component to it in that when the kingdom of heaven comes into Rowan, it spreads into Rowan's dough and will over time permeate Rowan and make Rowan more like the kingdom of heaven, more like Jesus. But it'll also permeate into the church and into the society through the church, and it permeates. The other thing about yeast, and I know this from my pre-COVID pizza making days when I did a pizza making thing with Jill one time. When you put the yeast into the dough, you got to really blend that thing through for a long time to get that yeast to work through the dough. It takes time. It's not like you drop a little bit in and suddenly just explodes through. You've got to do a lot of work to turn it around to make it blend. It's a tiny bit of yeast somehow has to spread across the whole dough through lots of mixing. It's a slow process. So maybe Jesus is saying when the kingdom of heaven comes, it's a slow churning process. Over time, the more churning, the more mixing of that dough you do, the more the kingdom of heaven will permeate it, which kind of fits with my life. As I read the Bible, as I pray, as I do go about doing Christian life, as I do discipleship, I belong to Jesus, I'm becoming like Jesus and I'm building his kingdom. That's a process. And the longer I'm doing that and the more I'm doing that, the more his kingdom yeast is
more I become like Christ.
The more I become like Christ, yeah. I reckon it's a simple proverb, but that's a simple parable. That's what Jesus is trying to say. It's not always flash in the pan, someone becomes a believer and suddenly they're a preacher and the world change. In fact, Jesus would say more often than not, it's probably not going to last.
No.
It's a slow, journeyed process of day by day churning over, spreading that kingdom yeast through our lives and through our church and into the community.
It's more like, or what's the reference? Where more Christian life is a marathon.
Yes.
Not a sprint.
Not a sprint, yeah.
Yeah, because you'll crash and burn.
Exactly. And if we try to get the yeast to rise, get the dough to rise when the yeast has not been blended through, it's not going to be a good loaf of bread.
No.
It's not going to work. So we've got to do that blending process if we're going to get the yeast to rise and become what it should be. Yeah.
So can I ask, why does Jesus, why did he speak to parables to the general crowd, but not be matter of fact when he would, to the disciples? He'd be blunt.
He'd be more blunt with the disciples, So he actually says there, he speaks to them. Read the words and I'll unpack it.
He always used stories, illustrations when speaking to the crowds. He never spoke to them without using such parables. It fulfilled what God had spoken through the prophet. I will speak to you in parables. I will explain things hidden since the creation of the world.
So another gospel version, they ask him, why do you speak to the people in parables? I think a different version. And he says, well, the keys of the kingdom of heaven have been given to you, but not to others. And then he quotes this parable as well. He says, though seeing they will always not see, and though believing they will not understand, though hearing they will not understand. And so this has been a point of confusion. I was raised to think, Jesus tells parables because they're easy to understand. Well, hang on a second. Some of these are really confusing. And you've only got to look at it and go, the disciples didn't understand many of them. So it's not that they're easy to automatically understand. It's that he uses simple everyday things that they did understand to illustrate points that maybe are deeper and more complex than than are at surface level. So the best explanation I've ever heard for this, Phil, is that it was actually a sign of Jesus' grace that he hid meaning of parables in confusing stories, or he kind of hid the meaning of what he was trying to say below the surface. He used something they understood, but invited them into greater digging. But what it did, by doing that, it does two things. One, it sorts out those who want to dig and research and think and chew over and let the yeast work through them to get the revelation. But also, too, it's sufficiently hidden that they would not be held accountable for it if they didn't believe it.
Okay.
Now, that actually sits with me. That Jesus would, he put a seed out there and go, here's a little bait. This is the way the Jewish Old Testament worked anyway. They would use remezes. They would use these little hints that would force you to go back and look at other things, little hyperlinks. For the person who's genuinely looking, that's an invitation into deeper knowledge. But for the person who's not interested in looking, there's actually they have a plausible deniability. They can say, well, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And Jesus hid it from them so that they would not be held accountable by his grace for something that they should have known that they didn't know. That doesn't let them off the hook completely, but what it means is they may not be held accountable because they didn't actually hear it. Now, it's their fault they didn't hear it because the invitation was there. Does that make sense? But it gives a degree of plausible deniability, to use that term, so that they're actually Jesus is graciously avoiding judgment while also deeply inviting the inquisitive and the seeker into mining the meaning at a deeper level. Phil is, just for those that aren't on YouTube, Phil is looking at me very quizzical here, very weird.
Because I've never heard it as the plausible deniability sort of thing.
It's a fairly new thing to me too, but it makes, I can't remember where I heard it, but it does make a bit of sense to me.
Like I've definitely heard it's like, well, okay, gives you the avenue to delve more into it, to think and dig more into it. And I'm just then reminded of the parable of the sower and the seeds, and throwing the seeds onto the hard ground and all that, where it takes root or doesn't take root. But I hadn't thought of, well, God's given a little bit of a way out of judgment. But I was like, wow, I hadn't thought of that one, and I was like, I have to think about that one.
And absolutely so. It's something I came across. I don't even remember where I came across it. Maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah, I was doing some research into the parables and studying them, and it came that very question you asked me: why did Jesus hide things? You know, what was going on? What would be the reason that Jesus says the keys of the kingdom have been given to you, but not to others? Yeah. Why would Jesus say he's hiding things? Because that doesn't sound very Jesus-like. No. Jesus came to make truth known, so why would Jesus hide things? And it's only as I've reflected on that meaning a bit more, I've gone, well, actually, the Jesus I know would hide things out of grace. Yeah. While still offering the inquisitive an opportunity to go deeper. And it's what I mean is it's the only thing that I can reconcile. So the listeners might think of other things, but it's the way I can reconcile a gracious Jesus rather than a Jesus who's deliberately seeking out to hide things from people because he's somehow narcissistic or sinister or it fits the narrative of the personality of Jesus more.
Because I was just reminded of these sort of saying, well, you don't throw pearls to the swines. Yes. Who will just trample into the ground. So it's like, well, that's weighing it up. Is it...
Okay, yep.
Is it... okay, I know that I'm going to be giving you parables, so, okay, I'm not going to waste my time
on you. Yep.
If you're not going to try digging for it.
Let's go with that. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense too. Which is less grace focused and more just I'm not going to spend my time. Mind you, the amount of time and effort it takes into telling a parable is more work than the straight truth. I do think, like we're both certainly in agreement, I think it's an invitation into digging deeper. And so much of the Bible is like that. It's an invitation into digging deeper. If you're reading something and it's confusing, that's not a sign to tune off. We've talked about that a lot on this podcast, especially certainly when it was the Bible, wait, what? We'd pick those wait, what moments and go, that's an invitation into dig deeper because there's a depth of meaning and revelation and understanding which will blow your mind when you go deeper. Yeah. And so I think that makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah. These parables do that. The other thing I'd just add about the yeast mentality is this is probably it's interesting Jesus turns the whole meaning of yeast in the scripture on its head here. Yeah. Because in all the scriptures, apart from this parable, yeast is seen in a negative light. Yeah. In the Old Testament, they were to take yeast out of the feast of unleavened bread. It was seen as a little bit of sin. Yeah. A little bit of sin gets in. Yeast is seen in the sinful way. It gets in, and we all know that. It gets in and it permeates our heart in the same way. Paul says, don't you know a little yeast gets into the dough and, he uses it in a negative light. So that's the way it's used in all of Scripture. But Jesus seems to have no problem here turning it on its head and going, but the kingdom of heaven's also like that. A little bit of the kingdom of heaven can get in and it can have a positive effect as well. Yeah, but it's the only time it's used in a positive light in all of the Bible, I think.
Yeah. I just had another thought. It's like, well, Jesus is like, in the culture of the day is... Well, Jesus used an example of a woman. It's like, women were not as high in society. So Jesus is also sort of saying, is he sort of going, well, okay, I'm including everybody.
Yeah, so the kingdom of heaven is not like a priest who went and did such and such. It's like a woman who was baking some bread. Yeah. So it's available for the for the anybody.
Anybody, but it's yeah. So that's
I'll pay that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
So it's an open invitation to anybody.
Yeah.
So Jesus is the master storyteller. This is the thing about these parables. They're simple. Well, we started this year's podcast talking about the salt of the earth, Jeannie and I. Such a simple little one-phrase statement, but so nuanced and rich in meaning that is at a depth that is beyond. I mean, we spent ages talking about the salt of the earth, and then one of the young girls in church at our Illawarra location came up to me and she said, "Oh, you missed a point about salt being related to the word salary and being payment." And I went, "Oh, yeah, that's right. I knew that, and I never even brought that up." So Jesus just has all this depth in the parables. Yeah. So keep mining them, keep looking, get going richer and deeper, and you'll find more and more in this stuff.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. All right, that's the parable of the yeast. Tomorrow we're heading in to look at what are we doing tomorrow?
Jesus praising
Gethsemane tomorrow. Okay, that's we head towards Easter. Let's do Gethsemane. We'll talk to you tomorrow, everybody.
Okay.
See you then.
See ya.